Hey, Craig here from Gizz For the New. Usually not an advertisement kind of guy. Never did advertisements on the podcast, but we're going to do a little something different with this podcast because I think there's a different kind of ad that we can do that would be pretty fucking cool. So I want to shout out Green Coast Creative. You can find them on Instagram at greencoastco_creative, and they have an Etsy store, greencoastco.etsy.com, where I just ordered a mycelium shirt and a KGLW ACDC font shirt. But there's lots of stuff there, tons of stuff. Not only Gizz, you got some Phish, you got some Taylor Swift as well. The first shout out of many to the incredibly creative people in this community that are just doing amazing art. And I'll shout one out on each show. Definitely check them out. Amazing, amazing stuff. Friends and weirdos, welcome to basically the first real episode of Gizz For the New. I'm Craig, for those of you who don't know me. For those of you who do know me, you probably also know my guest. This dude is partly responsible for the musical obsession that dominated the last 10 years of my life. By the way, happy 10 years to this friendship. So you can blame him for my excessive and annoying oversharing of set lists, listening sessions, and memes on social media. It's Mr. Rob Grabill. How are you?
I'm doing great, Craig. I'm so happy we have a chance to do this. I feel like this has been building pretty much since the start of the year, and so much has happened between those preliminary texts and conversations and recommendations, and I can only imagine what we're able to get into now that we've got the bulk of the year behind us.
Well, it's funny you should say that because I do have a list I can start with here. We got Philly Carini 23, Gamehenge, Mexico, Sphere, Tiny Desk, Billy Strings, Billy Joel, Bruce Springsteen. Come on, did we pick the best time to stop Weekapod or what?
I gotta say, it's been such an interesting year for Phish, and I know I don't want to get too derailed from the whole reason we're talking here, but it is really interesting what Phish has turned out this year, and to know that, quite frankly, it took a back seat. And honestly, that's sort of how this whole thing got started. To dive right into it, we started talking about Gizz because I came to you with the confession that I was going to be skipping Mondegreen this year, which was the big Phish festival they had in Dover. And of course, you were curious to know why. And the reason was twofold. Reason number one was because I'm getting old, and the idea of camping for 4 or 5 nights, no matter what good came of that, was just a little bit more than these old bones could picture. But number two, and honestly, the kind of nail in the coffin was I was invited to the 2 Forest Hills marathon shows for King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, and I couldn't think of a better way to really get into live Gizz. And so for the first time in, gosh, at least 10 years, and that's only since getting back on the train, I prioritized something over Phish. And when I told you that, I think it lit a spark for you as well. And now here we are in the back half of the year, and look at us go.
Yeah. So just to give a little background for those who don't know, Rob and I did a podcast called Weekapod Groove on the Pods and Sods Network, which was my previous podcast network for 10 years. We would keep in touch about Phish stuff. We saw 2 great shows in Philly over the summer. You saw more. I finally saw my second and third. So that's, I guess, the postscript to Weekapod Groove. Craig finally got outside with just having one show under his belt. But the whole Gizz thing has been interesting to me. And it's probably something that's going to come up a lot on episodes, but just in a nutshell, as a Phish obsessive for a long time, the first thing that really kind of gave me a clue, and there had been like little hints, I'd hear them dropped all the time, but the thing that I really took notice of was there was a Reddit thread that was, if Phish wasn't your favorite band, who would be? And a lot of the answers were, Phish is not my favorite band, King Gizzard is. And I was like, okay, that's an interesting thing to read on the Phish subreddit. And I flirted with listening during a workday once, and then the conversation with you about Mondegreen and everything was just all I needed. Your enthusiasm was, definitely palpable. It definitely, I felt the same almost immediately after listening. I do want to get into kind of like the first things you heard and things like that, because I don't know that we ever talked about that, and I'm curious. So that's where we're coming from. Two Phish guys, you with a much more extensive Phish history than me, and me as kind of like the student that you helped along for a long, long time. And it's interesting now that we're kind of in this spot watching this group who is doing amazing things right now. And I don't think you'll take offense to this, but you're not looking at it from the view of somebody that's got a lot of jaded experiences with the band under your belt. And I say that because, you know, there are absolutely bands I had the same thing with, you know. So it's a real interesting place to be. Why don't we start there? What was the first thing you heard and what was your reaction to it?
So Gizz first came on my radar. I'm ashamed to even say it, but back in 2015, as a pretty avid Phish guy at the time, because I was still really in the throes of getting back on the train, having only seen my first show again the previous year in 2014. I did spend some time on the message boards, and I do typically follow threads about people recommending other music. While I don't have 100% overlap with the general Phish fan base, when you see the same bands coming up over and over again, you can't help but wonder, like, oh, like maybe there's something here for me. I should go check it out. And then Paper Mache Dream Balloon came out, and everyone was really hyping it as it being something kind of new and different from the band. I listened. I liked it a lot. But I think because I didn't have anything to compare it to, I didn't really realize what a departure it was from everything that the band had done to date. So I listened to it. I really enjoyed it. But it didn't in any way like win the band over for me in a way that's like, okay, now I'm locked in. Now I'm going to follow everything that they do. Right. So admittedly fell a bit off of the wayside thereafter. I think the next time they came up on my radar was a couple of years later, when in 2017 they put their 5 albums out, which I have to admit was news that I greeted with a fair degree of skepticism, because 5 albums in a year seems pretty stunty to me and not necessarily indicative of a band that's taking their output terribly seriously.
That's fair.
Maybe they're going more for quantity than quality. Mm-hmm. So admittedly, I kind of wrote that off without much further consideration. And then I think it was a relatively harmless comment that came in 2022. Someone had said, oh, if you're a Phish fan and you're on the fence about Gizz, you might want to try the album Ice, Death, Planets, Lungs, Mushrooms, and Lava. It's about as close to like a proper jam band album as they've ever put out. You might like it a lot. Mm-hmm. I did listen to it. I did like it. Mycelium jumped out at me right away as being like, this is gloriously Fishy, and I'm a huge, huge fan of it.
Yes.
Ice 5 was such a great groove. It was kind of a next level of funk that I think Phish hasn't really come anywhere near in gosh, closing in on 30 years now. So big fan of that. And then I remember listening to Lava and just being completely transfixed at like the groove that was set up by just the repeated vocal pattern, and just knowing that they were leaning so hard into vocals as being part of the groove that they were setting. And so I was a big fan of that. Yeah. But I listened to that, I remember, within days of it coming out, and then was completely oblivious to the fact that before the end of that month, they put out 2 more albums as well. Right. Which I think, you know, if Gizztober in 2022 is a bigger accomplishment, putting out 3 albums in a month as opposed to putting out 5 albums in a year, you know, it's kind of hard to say, you know, which I hold in high regard. But it did start to open the door for me, that there was maybe more than meets the eye with these guys, and that they were putting music out in a less stunty way that I think I originally had the preconceived notion of. Right. After that, I heard Gamma Knife. And I was like, hey, that's great. But again, didn't really push it much further than that. And then Tale as Old as Time, I met a girl and was interested in this girl. And early on in the conversation, it became clear that she had an obsession for Gizz, rivaling my obsession for Phish. And so as we got a little bit closer, we actually started the process of trying to get each other into each other's bands. Happy to report that it worked both ways. And so now she is a converted Phish fan and I'm a converted Gizz fan. But I can say that the real breakthrough moment for me was hearing the Dripping Tap, and then also Nonagon Infinity as an album.
So a studio version of Dripping Tap you're talking about, yeah.
The studio version of Dripping Tap, yeah. So, on the whole, I think those two, because I think they exist in a pretty similar sonic space, kind of let me lock in, like, okay, here's one mode that Gizz operates in, and it's a mode that I like really quite a bit. And so it felt like I kind of had my feet underneath me in terms of really trying to understand their output as a band. And, with that kind of as a base camp for me, it gave me a really good foundation upon which I could start exploring the rest of the catalog.
As probably would be expected when getting into a band like this, you supplied me. I won't actually, I started listening, and then it took you maybe, 10, 20 minutes to be like, hey, can I steer your listening in a different direction here? And you gave me a list of what to listen to first and then broke the rest of it down. What was your introductory listening going through the catalog? How did you do it?
So I think once I'd gotten the established kind of baseline I'd mentioned with Nonagon and then Dripping Tap, the first thing I did was to check out the rest of Omnium Gatherum, which is the album that Dripping Tap is for. And I think that can work if you just have an incredibly open mind and are ready to just hear, 10 different versions of Gizz. Mm-hmm. But in general, that's not necessarily something that I would recommend to people, just because there's a lot of stuff on there that doesn't really sound like Gizz. And I think there's a lot of stuff on there that's maybe a little abrasive to the uninitiated when you don't kind of have a better sense of the overall charm of the band and can sort of appreciate the deviations from the norm, which I think that album has on full display.
Yeah.
I think it's a great album to go back to once you do have that foundation, because in a way you sort of get a taste of everything they've done so far and everything that is yet to come. I think it kind of comes together in a really interesting way. I'd say, especially up until recently, of kind of everything that the band is capable of. So it's an album I go back to a lot these days, but I think it can maybe be a little rough up front. But with that being said, it opens up with Dripping Tap, and it's hard not to recommend an album that has what I still think is their greatest achievement sonically.
What is it about Dripping Tap?
To me, it's the idea that a band can take a chorus and a D vamp that goes into C very briefly before returning to the D vamp and then the chorus again, and stretch it out into 18 minutes and at no point have it being boring.
Yeah.
This is deeper consideration, and I think goes beyond what we're really going to get into if we're really focusing on studio albums today. But I think one of the things, anytime a band comes out and people really like them, like, the worst thing you could say about them is they're a jam band, because that just immediately is going to be dismissive to everyone involved. I think in a lot of ways, there are aspects of Gizz that are akin to what you hear from different jam bands, but I really think of them as more of being kind of like a vamp band as opposed to a jam band. And Dripping Tap to me kind of represents sort of the platonic ideal of that approach, which is like, it actually is a pretty seriously structured multi-part song. It's just that they're not jamming so much as they're kind of hanging out in a particular version of a vamp for a while, then they jump to the next one, hang out there for a while, then they jump to the next one. So it's long form composition, but in a slightly more interesting, and I think I would go so far as to say, like, more engaging than what you're typically going to hear from a studio release from a jam band in general. And one of my favorite things to do is every time that they play it, I'll go back and listen to it. And it's really interesting how similar each version is. But again, we may be getting a feel of kind of focusing on studio albums as intro, which is, I know, really what we're looking to do today.
Well, I figured we'd probably be flirting with live talk, but, of course, we're going to have a separate segment where we dive very deep into your initial live experiences, and then the Chicago show, which we saw together, all four of us, which was a real nice experience.
That was great.
Yeah, seriously, it's real interesting that, and I have podcasting friends like this that, like, in the last 7 years, you and I have seen each other twice. We both live kind of in Philly, and the second time we got together was in Chicago. So that was, that's what Gizz does. Now, once you had decided you're on this path, you're outside of the listening to Ice Death in 2022, all that stuff, and going through the discography proper, is there anything that you were surprised by in a good way, or anything that didn't jibe with you?
I'd say some of the last albums to fall into place for me were the microtonal albums, of which they have 3, because why wouldn't you have 3 microtonal albums? That's a perfectly normal thing to have. But Flying Microtonal Banana, KG, and LW didn't really click with me in quite the same way. And it's really tough. I mean, I made the effort to sit down and kind of table all other music listening until I'd had a chance to listen to each of the albums at least once. Mm-hmm. And I would just say, like, on its face, like, those didn't really jump out at me. And it's a combination of factors. One of the big ones being that there is a little bit of sameness. I think particularly on Flying Microtonal Banana, like, all the songs do sound pretty similar, which I don't think is inherently a bad thing. And it's also not uncommon for a Gizz album. I think you're going to see a lot of Gizz albums when you go through the discography where they really lock in to kind of a single concept. And the songs are all really made to sit alongside each other. Mm. And I think that's why when you take an album like Omnium Gatherum or Gumboot Soup, which is more of a catch-all sort of thing, there's a big contrast with those. So, and part of it too, I mean, microtonal music is not music that Western audiences developed an ear for over their listening careers. I mean, that's a generalization, but I think one that's generally pretty fair. I think it's a sound that can often sort of be, I don't want to say written off, but sort of categorized as being sort of strangely Eastern and just really far outside, I think, kind of the typical confines of what you'd expect to hear out of a rock band.
At one point you and I were talking, and you had said that you were at the stage where you were listening to live shows and trying to, like, in your head be like, okay, this is coming from here, this is coming from here. And you said that your blind spots at that point were KG and LW. And it's interesting because it was the same for me. Like, they just continued to pass me by. I don't know why, but it was, I think, and I guess we should probably get into, like, when it comes to the listening trajectory, live stuff plays a big part in this, because, like, to me, the whole purpose of doing the podcast and sitting down with each album and, being tremendously nerdy about it was that, I did the same thing. I went through all of the albums once initially when you got me into them, moved towards video stuff, and then quickly move towards live stuff. And so my listening is really shaped by what they've played live. So there's a lot of stuff that I'm really looking forward to getting to. And I've purposely not listened to it just so I could, like, get the listening session happening and, like, actually talk about it when it's fresh. But yeah, it's real interesting that those two albums kind of, like, were the blind spots for me too. And I'm not quite sure why. It's not like they were not performing stuff from them, but it was really, I guess, kind of taking in the live shows and hammering all that stuff that really kind of cemented the microtonal stuff for me. But that was probably the last of it to really kind of, make sense to me.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And, I think, first off, just because I know it was big for you as well, the KEXP performances, I would argue are about as good a place as any to introduce somebody, because, the first time I heard the songs off of Murder of the Universe, it was from the KEXP show where they played the majority of the Altered Beast suite. Mm-hmm. And I still think of that even now, listening to that album and seeing those songs live, just because you get to kind of hear the music, I think, as they hear it in their heads. I think they do a really good job for their studio albums. I have no problem saying that their studio albums are much stronger than Phish's, and I'd be much sooner to recommend somebody check those out as they're trying to get into the band. Whereas the Phish studio albums, especially anything they've put out in the last 25 years, are not necessarily anything that I would point people towards. So.
Right. When did you move from like the studio stuff to the live stuff, and how important was the live stuff in falling deeper into this rabbit hole?
I think maybe just because this is an approach that was so familiar to me from my Phish days, is although I was going back and checking out some archival live shows, it was more that when the European leg of their tour this year started up, I just thought it would be really fun to follow along. And this seems very quaint given how the year ended. Well, it's not done yet, but how the year progressed for them. Yeah. But there was like a guy on who had a Facebook page that was just KGLW streams. And as best I can tell, he had the blessing of the band to the point that he was getting a photographer pass and they were letting him in between the barricade and the stage. But he was just live streaming the shows on his phone. Yeah. Like there was no setup to it whatsoever. It was just a guy holding his phone up for 2.5 hours, or 3 in the case of marathon shows. But it was enough to be able to see them play, and the sound was decent. And because it was in Europe, I was getting to catch these shows in the afternoon. I could have them on in the background while I was working. And all of a sudden, it's kind of like you said, it's like, oh, the songs that I recognize, it's great. It's great to hear how good they sound live. But more and more, the stuff that didn't grab me on my first listen through all the albums was really jumping out at me a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And I think in general, Gizz is definitely a band where you can kind of get the live version first, and that'll almost get you more hyped to then go back to the studio versions of them and kind of hear that execution, because it's very different. I mean, I think most bands have a live sound where things get kind of compressed a little bit in terms of the sonic experience. Mm-hmm. And I think Gizz definitely is like that a little bit, where the songs that can sound very different on an album can actually sound pretty similar live. And in that way, and I'm going to make these comparisons a million times, so apologies because I'm starting already. In that way, Gizz really reminded me of Ween, because you take an album or a band like Ween, pick any of their albums, and every song is just such a radical shift from genre, from tone, from instrumentation. Mm-hmm. But then when you hear those same Ween songs live, there's a cohesiveness that I think is missing on the albums. And so in a lot of way, I think the live stuff is a little bit easier to take in just because it feels a little bit more cohesive. Whereas, the albums, I think, can sometimes be a little bit all over the place in a good way, ultimately, but in a way that I think is a little bit harder to dive into up front. Yeah. When I was getting into Ween, the first thing I checked out was Live in Chicago, and I was amazed at just what a great kick-ass rock and roll band they were, Yeah. But the studio stuff is a different beast. Exactly. And, obviously this is not a Ween podcast, and don't want to get too deeply into it, but having seen them a lot over recent years, I kind of look at all of their music in a totally different way now, because they pull off things that are recorded on albums and arranged in ways that you could never really successfully pull off live. And instead, they just come out there as a 5-piece and just act like they're one of the greatest rock bands of all time. And for the most part, I think they pull it off. Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting you bring up the streams, just kind of like on the point of KEXP. Just want to put out there, the first thing I watched,
And it might have even been that same day that you started recommending all this stuff. If it wasn't, it was the next day. It was very, very soon. And that night I watched KEXP. It was the Ice Death one. So my first images of King Gizzard were the KEXP, watching them do Iron Lung, Magma, and Ice 5. And I was just like, who the fuck are these guys? Like, what is happening here? Because, and then I moved to Chunky Shrapnel. And then that was just like a complete left turn, from going from Ice Death to Rat's Nest Tour was sobering. But the whole time I watched Shrapnel, I was like, I was speechless the whole time. The first time that I was like, okay, there's something special going on here, but there was a very big turning point that always sticks in my head. It was the May 31st acoustic show. And you had mentioned that it was being streamed. I put it on. It was the end of the workday. I think it was like 3 or 4 o'clock. It was a great day to like wind down work. And I was riveted. And then, we were kind of talking about following the tour and everything. And I realized then that like I was very spoiled with live Phish, like you were the one that introduced me to listening to the live show the next day, like through the entire tour, which I did for, quite a few Phish tours and over the last couple of years, every Phish tour, and then realized it was going to be a little work to find these. But as soon as the US tour started, like you and I were just waiting for the stream. And I remember just seeing Gizz's Instagram post and I was like, dude, I think they're like officially streaming. And then of course, we were given riches on this tour, just insane. When it comes down to like, I don't know, Taylor Swift will release a 10-minute song and everybody's like, nobody's ever done this before. Gizz is doing stuff that I really don't think has been done before. Like, I don't think that a band has offered the stems to an entire tour before. And in short order, like towards the end, they were a couple days after the show. So yeah, just like so many riches and so much fun also.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, the comparisons to Phish here are stark because Phish is a band of multimillionaires. Phish as an organization employs hundreds of people. Phish has embraced capitalism to a pretty shocking degree.
That shocks you?
I mean, maybe it didn't shock me as much until I saw somebody do something different, I guess would be the easiest way to put it.
That's fair. Okay.
It's like, I get it. And, people deserve to get paid what the market will bear. So to see a band come and probably by now have full recognition that they could be extracting a lot more money from their fan base. And instead they're giving away everything Phish gives away. And then also giving away also for free stuff that Phish would never dream of giving away.
Yeah.
And it's, people looked at Phish as being magnanimous for continuing to allow people to tape even as they had their own streaming options. Gizz obviously is letting people continue to tape, but in the meantime, providing soundboard stems for everyone to do what they will, not only for their own personal use, but giving them the green light to go ahead and release these things and press them to vinyl. So it is the logical continuation of sort of when they put out Polygon Land and gave that away for free. But to see them do that for the duration of an entire tour, to give away all the video and all the audio and all the stems and give you the opportunity to do whatever you want with all of that, I mean, that's riches. I mean, the amount of money that could generate if they sold it for even a marginal fee, that could probably be more money than they're actually making off the tour itself.
Sure.
And to recognize that and know that they're rejecting that because it's more important that they put the music in the hands of fans than it is to make money off of it. Like, it does sort of make you go back to Phish, and it's just like, wow, like there's quite a difference here in the approach you're taking.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah, and this will not be the last time we compare Gizz to Phish. This will not be the last time I compare Gizz to Ween. I think they are useful reference points when I make those comparisons and when I ultimately land on, but I like the way Gizz does it better. It is not meant as a knock against those other bands in the slightest.
Sure.
Like what Phish is doing is still more generous than 99.9% of what any other musical artist out there does, right, especially one at their level of fame. So none of this is in any way taking away from Phish's approach. More than anything, it's acknowledging how amazing Phish's approach is to point out just how amazing Gizz's approach is, because it goes, leaps beyond what even Phish has done in terms of the generosity to their fans. And, I just... It's kind of astounding when you step back. For anyone who doesn't know, Gizz seemingly with a day or two's notice was like, hey, we're going to stream video from the entire tour for free, except for Philadelphia, who won't let us do it.
Of course.
And like that wasn't like this planned grand thing that like everyone could look forward to. I found out about it when I was already in New York getting ready to go to the Forest Hill show. It dropped very late before the tour started.
Yep. How far do you get into the collecting of Gizz? Are you strictly a music guy? Are you a physical media guy? Are you a bootleg shirt guy?
I'm not normally a poster guy, but the Philly show was special to me for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that I got inside and the poster line was mercifully short. And I just decided, it's like, you know what, like this show's going to mean a lot to me. I'm always going to want to remember it. And that poster is sick as hell. So yeah, whatever. I'll plunk down $50 and get a nice frame for this. No problem. But I haven't jumped into the fan created stuff too much. I do browse through Etsy every once in a while and have thrown some lizard patches into my cart, but have not gotten around to pulling the trigger.
Yeah, there's some great stuff. Out of all the kind of like official merch, it was the Chicago show was kind of my special show, being the first with that I'd see with Megan, my girlfriend, who will be joining us for a future conversation about the shows. So I really wanted a poster, and I was like, there's no fucking way I'm going to get a poster. Like, I'm looking at the Reddit threads, and it's like, yeah, people are lining up at 2:00, and it was just like, there's going to be no way. And again, I was pleasantly surprised to get in there and be like, yeah, I think this is doable. And it was totally doable,
Yeah.
I think years of the Phish poster deal kind of like, affected my thoughts about the whole process.
It's a really interesting thing, because I think anytime you dive into a band who has this much out there and whose fans are so devoted to the band, it can sometimes begin to feel like everything is Gizz and Gizz is everywhere. But one of the things that became abundantly clear to me very, very quickly is most people have never heard of this band before. The number of times people have asked me, what concerts I've seen this summer that I was a really big fan of, and Gizz is one of the first things I mentioned. Like, I think one time I got an, oh yeah, I've heard of them, which it's like, with a name like that, like, how have you literally gone your whole life this far as a fan of music and not even heard the name? Because I know if you've heard it once, you're not going to forget it.
Yes.
But it's again hard not to compare to something like Phish, just because so many of the trappings are so the same. But I think the thing you got to remember is that's just not the level of fame they're at for now, at least. Could they get there? Absolutely. Are they perhaps on their way there already? I would not be surprised to hear it. But, take the Chicago show, I think, as a great example. Like, Northerly Island is a venue Phish has played, absolutely. But when Phish plays them, they open up the back gates and let an additional 15,000 people in. Like, it is just completely different levels of scale. So when you talk about the scarcity of posters at Phish, which does involve lining up hours and hours and hours ahead to even have a chance at a poster, versus, a fan base at a show that's going to be maybe a third of the size, it's just not going to be quite the same struggle. And I think, Gizz is also not trying to milk things at all. They're printing enough posters that for the most part, as long as you don't mind waiting in a bit of a line, you can get one. And I was noticing that posters from previous shows were actually making it to subsequent shows. So they're not all instant sellouts that if you weren't in line for 3 hours before the venue opened, you're going to miss out on. And for me, that's ideal. I take no joy in acquiring a poster just because it's rare. I get a poster because I want the poster.
Yeah.
So whatever makes that easiest to accomplish is an approach that I'm on board with.
Is there anything in the catalog anything that they're not playing live that they should be?
I mean, a lot.
Because obviously there are albums that haven't been touched,
Yeah. So, I think you can look at this in a couple of different ways. There are, in general, and again, like, I'm no historian, and I think especially prior to 2017 or so, I really have not gone back and looked so much at a lot of the stuff they played. But I think things can fall into two categories. One are, they'll release an album, they'll play pretty much everything from it for a while, and then just sort of lock into the songs that they like better than others and just sort of leave the rest behind. Mm-hmm. So, like, when I think of Fishing for Fishies, some of my absolute favorite songs off of that are Real's Not Real and Birdsong, and they just don't play those. And they've literally never played the title track before, not even once. And that's wild to me because, like, those are some of my absolute favorite songs off of the album, and they're just sort of, left sitting on the shelf.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting because I think this band has the capability to do bust outs in a way that very few can, just because their catalog is so deep. But then they kind of run into the thing of when they put out Butterfly 3000, that they put this album out without any serious plans to play much of anything from it. So if I'm not wrong, I think they've only played Shanghai. It's only been 20 times. And At the time, it might have been the result of not really having the instrumentation on stage for it. It's a very synth-heavy album, and they, for a while, did not even have the equipment at their disposal to play these songs if they wanted, short of severely rearranging them. That is evolving, and now they have a big modular synth table that they can wheel out on stage so they can play stuff from Silver Cord. That has not yet led to them playing anything else from that album, but it does seem at any time that could change. And I believe I think you had shown me a picture someone had taken of the table, and it had presets for a couple of the songs off of Butterfly.
Yep.
But we didn't actually get to hear any of them so far, at least on this tour.
Not yet. Here's something. When I was going through my listening journey, one of the things I did was take in all of the promotional videos in a row over the course of a night or two. Have you gotten into the videos at all? Because there's some just absolutely ridiculously incredible things in there.
I've seen a handful of them. And every time I watch one, I ask myself why I have not gone through the effort of making sure that I see all of them, because each one is just mind-bending, for better or worse.
Yeah.
Some are literally insane, and others are just sort of unexpected and fun and weird.
Yeah.
But like when I saw the Planet B video, I'm like, what are you guys even doing? Like this is just absurd. But it's very interesting because, I have a lot that I could say about music videos in the year 2024 and what the purpose of them even is and who the audience is and what we're trying to accomplish, because more often than not, it feels like music videos are less about attracting new fans and more about delivering fan service from the people who are already on board.
Yeah.
And I think that's legit. And I think it's something that Gizz has leaned into in a big way. Like, I don't think when they put out the video for La Risque most recently, I don't think they were necessarily intending on catching people who had maybe never heard the band before. Mm-hmm. The song, sure, but the video, not so much.
Oh, no.
That is that is a video intended to make existing Gizz fans happy, not to attract new ones in the slightest.
Yep. Do you fuck with the side projects? And if so, why is Cookies always the best?
So I must say my side project exploration has largely been limited to Ambrose's stuff. So, I think the Murlocs are generally considered to be kind of the biggest of the Gizz side projects. And I have listened to a lot of the Murlocs. I did really like Ambrose's album that he put out with Gum, aka Gumbros. I thought that was really strong, really enjoyed it. And it felt like it was really quite different from the Murlocs, and in any way was kind of picking up off of a lot of the more synth driven stuff that Gizz has been putting out over recent years. Beyond that, though, I have to admit, I'm pretty dry in terms of checking that out. So if this is your way of telling me I need to pay more attention to what Cookie is up to, I can take the hint.
New Pipe Eye is coming. Might already be out by the time this episode drops. The one piece of the catalog that I haven't hit yet at all, I'm saving until after going through the albums for the podcast, and that's the 6 demo albums, and I'm so excited for that.
Yeah.
Just knowing that is there, and I have not even touched it yet, and there's 6 volumes to enjoy, including multiple dripping taps.
Yeah.
Have you gotten into the demo stuff at all?
I have. I think as I went through the completionist project of listening to all of the official releases, I had the momentum to keep going, but even then I was still struggling to comprehend everything I'd already listened to. So I definitely owe all of those a more thorough listen. But I think it's a really great example of how deep and solid their stuff is, because they leave more songs on the table than most bands even have in their repertoire.
Yeah.
And this is not throwaway stuff. Like, it's not always, the most sonically pleasing stuff. It's not always stuff that would translate well into live performance, but there's care and thought put into everything that they release. And honestly, like, when you really see the scope of everything that they've put out in a pretty limited period of time, it's kind of staggering to realize just how prolific they are.
Yeah. Maybe we wrap up on this topic, unless you have anything else that we can hit afterwards. But, and I could care less about the, band politics, but just kind of like from a sound point of view, let's talk about 2 drummers versus 1. That was a real it was one of the interesting things about Chunky Shrapnel to me, coming from the KEXP performance and then moving to a metal band with 2 drummers. It just did not seem like the same band. And I guess in some ways it's not.
Yeah. This is potentially a blind spot for me. And given that I was technically a percussion major in college, it might be a little bit sacrilegious for me to say. I already am skeptical of bands that employ both a drum kit and a percussionist on stage anyway. I have not always felt like the value add is there. When it comes to 2 drum kits, I've just never entirely understood the appeal. Maybe this is by virtue of me getting into them after it's been calves only for a number of years now. But even going back and looking or listening to older recordings when Eric was still in the band, I'm not necessarily seeing, like, I guess it would be easier to say I don't feel like anything is lacking by virtue of there only being 1 drummer.
Agreed.
Like, I think that's an easier leg to stand on than, Eric added nothing. But I certainly don't miss the second drummer in their performance.
I believe is it the paper mache credits that list nothing for Eric? I think so. They're one of the albums under like who does what. It literally says Eric Moore nothing. I think it's paper mache.
And you can only talk about this for so long without kind of getting into the politics of it. But
sure.
I think a relatively like value neutral statement to say is that Eric's role in the band, it seems, was always much more about management than it was about performance.
Yeah.
So I think that's hopefully a relatively non-controversial thing to say. And, whatever decisions led to his departure, I think I mean, this is a terrible thing to say, but like he was probably the only dispensable member of the band. Like no, you can't get rid of anybody else in that band. But like Eric, I think there was room to cut him.
Okay. Yeah. Musically, I think I'd agree. Yeah. I do have a bit of a closing thing. Is there anything we didn't hit that you would want to talk about?
I guess I would just ask you, Craig.
Oh shit.
Could you say you have a favorite album or a favorite song at this time?
Favorite album. I was going to I was being cagey about this because I was like, I'm just going to wait until the episode drops and then you'll know. But there really is no need to be that pretentious, especially at my age. My favorite album right now is Changes. And it's interesting to me because you really talked up Butterfly, and Butterfly didn't do it for me the way Changes did. Butterfly took a little bit. And the reason that I have more time with Butterfly 3000 is that I have the Ocular Blu-ray edition. So I've watched and that's the one album they did videos for every song. Some of them were commissioned out. If you haven't seen the Catching Smoke video, that's definitely one to see. One of the best. So yeah, Changes for me, it was nobody that did it for me, interestingly enough. My trajectory listening to like stuff like Red Rocks, there are days I'd put on Red Rocks 22 and just that's the 8 hours of work just playing in the background. And I'd hear these little hooks and I'd be like, okay, which song is this? Which song is this? And it was so interesting to be like, okay, this is the Dripping Tap. I've seen tons of shit written about it on Reddit. Don't think I've heard it. Now I've heard this hook. I've looked it up and that's what it is. And yeah, okay. Yeah, that's great. In terms of song, I mean, Jesus Christ, it's tough. If I was to just give you an off the cuff right now, AstroTurf. I'm always in the mood for it. I don't know that it's my favorite per se. Those things change. I mean, for me, a favorite is the entire fucking Nonagon Infinity album. But like, you know, every time AstroTurf comes on, just what a nice light, another great video as well. You know, I tend to like their kind of weirder, bouncier shit, you know. But also, like, I love them for getting me back into metal. Like, I haven't really been a metal fan since I was a kid. Like, I was an Iron Maiden kid in middle school. And I just, you know, it was one of those things that just didn't really stick with me over the years. But man, it's like, and I hate to bring up Phish again, but like the whole genre diverse thing, which is one of the things that really endeared me to Phish. I mean, Gizz is adding metal on top of it, and things that are maybe a little more in my wheelhouse than, you know, the overall scope of what Phish does. So, you know, it was they kind of pulled me in that way as well. But also they just are like decent dudes. Like that was one of the things when I got into this band. When I get into any band, it's like, okay, what's the asshole factor here? And like, you know, they like to drink and get rowdy and say cunt a lot on stage, and that's basically it. They just seem like really genuine fucking guys, and like that really makes me love them even more. I gave a whole dissertation that was very outside of the question that you asked.
No, I agree, and I think working backwards from that answer, like it's always very strange to consider, especially with bands that do like sort of heavier stuff. It's like how much of this is performative versus like how hardcore are these dudes actually? Yeah. And to me, there's something so charming about what goofballs these guys are, and yet they can just put out this total ass-kicking metal. Like two just unbelievably hard albums.
Both that, like, insanely great.
Really go. Yes. Like really go. Yes. And to see kind of their ability to just switch on a dime and be able to rock all that stuff so hard, but then be able to turn around and play some of their more thoughtful psychedelic stuff or some of their more folk stuff. Or, as I think is, you know, most pertinent at this time, B741 is completely unlike anything they've ever done before. Like, the closest parallel you have is Fishing for Fishies, and it's similar in that it's, you know, pretty upbeat, but in terms of what they're actually doing from a songwriting perspective, from a performance perspective, topically, all of it, their range is just completely out of control, and it just feels like every time they try something new, they knock it out of the park. I think, too, this is, again, why I can't get too far down any of this without eventually starting to veer into the live performance, because there is nothing that I have heard live that I haven't loved more. Like, the Silver Chord stuff in general, I kind of bounced off of it as an album, but now that I've gotten to see it a few times live, I absolutely love it, and I can't wait to see more. I love both Infest the Rat's Nest and PDA just as albums. Having heard a bunch of that stuff live, I now love it even more.
Were you a metal guy at all?
I was never a huge metal guy. I have a good friend who is super into metal, but like me, has a really diverse set of musical tastes.
Right.
And a few years ago, we started kind of doing a little bit of a trade-off where he would drag me to some metal shows. I would drag him to, you know, kind of Rob type music. And we both sort of developed like individual appreciations for it. So
nice. I
tend to be a bigger fan as far as kind of like hard stuff goes. I tend to like hardcore. I tend to like post-punk. But like true ass-kicking grit your teeth metal, I typically never dipped much further than like Maiden and Priest and Metallica and Anthrax. Like I never really got into the depths of it the way that a lot of people do. What's funny is that even loving Gizz's take on it as much as I do, it hasn't necessarily inspired me to go further. It's just like, oh no, like this is the metal I like. It just happens to be made by the same band that I love so much.
Oh yeah, like I'm totally content with this. And there's a ton of it. In terms of an embarrassment of riches of a discography, in a fairly short period of time, they don't come a whole lot better than this. And, you know, as you mentioned before, the amount of quality really shines. Like, are there any albums you think are lacking? Like not something that you wouldn't put on, like something that's your least favorite, but do you think they miss the mark anywhere?
I mean, there's Eyes Like the Sky, which for what it is, I think it's very interesting. But I mean, one of the things that somebody said one time that I can't get out of my head, which is, I liked this just fine, but I don't think I would ever voluntarily listen to it ever again.
Yeah.
Which I think is not a criticism of it. It's just, it's almost like a musical in a way, you know? It's like, oh, like this is like a performance and I've seen it. So like, I'm good. Like, you know, no big deal there. And then Sketches of Brunswick East doesn't click with me in quite the same way. There are songs on it that I'm a big fan of. But, you know, as they're, you know, you got to draw the line somewhere in terms of how much studio stuff you're going to listen to. And in general, it's not something that, you know, I'm reaching for as I go through their discography.
I guess to kind of wrap up, there are two things that I'll kind of ask every guest. First of all, since this is Gizz for the New, give a recommendation for somebody that may need one.
Put on Dripping Tap. Don't be afraid by the fact that it's 18 minutes long. It's a very well-considered 18 minutes. It's not just a band dicking around for 18 minutes. And then from there, I would say, take a look online and get a vibe of what albums are and pick one that seems most closely aligned with the sort of music that you like. So if you're into kind of like 70s Southern arena rock type stuff, grab Flight B741. If you're into metal, grab PDA or Infest the Rat's Nest. If you're into jammier stuff, grab Ice Death. If you're into synth stuff, you can do Butterfly or Changes or Silver Chord. I think that those are probably the ones I'd start with. If you like punk, put on Nonagon. And then if you like storytelling, put on Murder of the Universe. So I wish it was so easy. If I had to narrow it down to one thing, though, I'd say Nonagon is about as good as the starting point as anyone's going to get. Because even though that's not fully descriptive of like everything Gizz does, I think the sound of Nonagon is what Gizz does best. And even on some of those other albums, you hear a lot of the elements that I think they first really knocked in with Nonagon.
Guests get to pick the instrumental musical bed that bookends the episode, and it will be something from the tour. You can pick any performance from the US leg of the tour that will be remixed and used as the bed for the beginning and the end of this episode.
I will go with Hot Water from the Philadelphia show.
Well, we are going to be back shortly with some chat about the live show with a very special guest, and I'm looking forward to that. But Rob, thanks for this. Always a pleasure to chat music with you, and thank you for getting me into another band that I can be obsessive about and annoy everybody I know.
You are very welcome, Craig, and even though I only joined a few weeks before you, welcome to the Weirdo Swarm.